Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Josh Snodgrass, and I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Oregon. I'll also be your host for this crash course on COVID. It's a six-part lecture series that I've designed and am making publicly available via YouTube. This first part will focus in on who I am and the perspective that I offer, as well as talk through what is in store for you in the videos later on in the series. I'm a professor of anthropology, but I'm also deeply involved in the University of Oregon's Global Health program. That includes being a core faculty member in the Global Health minor program, as well as one of the co-directors of the Center for Global Health. This series of lectures that I'm going to offer as this crash course on COVID is actually a redesigned lecture, two-part lecture that I gave for my Evolutionary Medicine or Anthropology 175 course that I teach each fall. And this year I adapted it to talk about COVID. And so I designed a two-part lecture, the first in October, the second in November. And now I've redone those and repackaged those into a six-part series that I hope will be of interest to a lot of people beyond just the students at the University of Oregon. It's meant to serve as a crash course in COVID, discussing everything from the basics of the disease, things like incubation as well as how it spreads, to then talking about who's most vulnerable to the disease, discussing issues like vaccination, as well as things like why we have failed as a society. The perspective that I offer comes as a biological anthropologist, or sometimes I call myself a human biologist. I received a PhD in anthropology from Northwestern University in 2004, and this included coursework, obviously, in anthropology, but also in medicine and public health. And then after finishing my PhD in anthropology, I went on to complete a National Institute on Aging postdoctoral fellowship in cognitive and social neuroscience at the University of Chicago, working very closely with the late John Cacioppo there, looking at issues of stress, loneliness, and the effects on physiology and health. I've served as a professor at the University of Oregon since 2005. I teach courses like Evolutionary Medicine that I've mentioned before as Anthropology 175, but I also teach courses like Human Growth and Development, Anthropology 369, as well as I'll be teaching a new course in the winter term of 2021 called Emerging Infectious Diseases and Pandemics. To give you a bit of a sense of the research that I do, I'm an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS, and I was elected in 2013. My research has been supported by several federal agencies, including the National Science Foundation, as well as the National Institutes of Health. And within the National Institutes of Health, my work has been supported by the institutes that focus in on aging, as well as institutes that focus in on child health and human development, as well as minority health and health disparities. My work has also been supported by a number of private foundations, including the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, as well as the LSB Leakey Foundation. I've published my research widely, including in a variety of anthropology journals, such as the American Journal of Human Biology, but I've also published in medical journals, such as The Lancet, as well as in general science journals like the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. My work is also goes into nutritional sciences, and I've published in American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Also, I've published within psychoneuroendocrinology, and then in various epidemiology journals, including the American Journal of Epidemiology. My research is really broad in terms of the different areas that I focus in on, but one of the threads of the research that I've done has focused in on the influence of social and environmental factors on health. This has included long-term work that initially started with my dissertation research in Siberia, which I completed the research in 2003 and finished my PhD in 2004. You can see on the lower right picture here is me with several of my collaborators, so Bill Leonard from Northwestern University, as well as Svetlana Petrova and Dr. Larisa Tarskaya. This was a photo taken in 2003 in a research project that was focused in part on social determinants of health, really looking at how the fall of the Soviet Union and then the subsequent development associated with the oil and gas as well as the diamond industry led to changes in cardiovascular and metabolic health. And so you can see here field work that was conducted in 2003 That was a project in Siberia that went on for many, many years. I've also been involved in a long-term project since 2005 in Ecuador, in the Morona Santiago region of Ecuador, working with an indigenous population known as the Shuar. And you can see in the lower left picture here my former graduate student, Tara Sipon Robbins, who is now Dr. Tara Sipon Robbins, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And we can see her working here doing the parasitology work in Ecuador. So essentially looking at the processing of fecal samples and looking at worms specifically and the burden of parasitic diseases in that population. One of the things that we've looked at is the development of the immune system and essentially the different developmental environment that different kids are in, whether they're exposed to worms or not, and when they're exposed to these parasitic worms in terms of the formation of the immune system, and whether there's a focus in on inflammatory responses or not. So this is both of these projects are long-term, highly collaborative, international projects that focus in on a variety of different social and environmental factors and how they affect health. And that includes cardiovascular health, metabolic health, as well as infectious and parasitic disease, and in some cases, mental health as well. I also have several projects that I've worked on in Oregon, highly collaborative projects, for example, up in the Woodburn area of Oregon in the northern Willamette Valley, looking at farm worker health, but then also several collaborations here in the Eugene-Springfield area, notably with a variety of psychologists focusing in on adversity in early life and how that affects health and human biology. Another thread that runs through my research is a focus in on biological adaptation to environmental stressors, including the physiological adaptation to chronic cold stress. So the other part of the Siberia work that I was just talking about a moment ago when I showed that picture from 2003, the other part of that from the health work is focused in on human biology and human biological adaptation. And so this work is testing the dimensions of metabolic responses to chronic cold stress. So looking at things like metabolic elevation, so using more calories at rest as a way of maintaining heat in very cold regions that we see in indigenous populations here, like what we see in this lower left picture of an individual from an indigenous population known as the Yakut or the Saha. Also, since 2005, I've been deeply involved with the World Health Organization's study on global aging and adult health, which is also known as the SAGE project. And that's an epidemiological study looking at patterns of aging as well as the contributors to aging in 6 middle-income countries. So looking at large populations through longitudinal study of older age populations in Russia, in South Africa, in China, in Mexico, Ghana, and India. And so these studies have focused in on determinants of health and aging. For example, everything from food security to universal health coverage to sleep to a variety of other things. So it's a project that I've been deeply involved with for about 15 years now. I've also, since 2007, run a biomarker lab here at the University of Oregon. Initially, this was located at the Peace Health campus, just off the University of Oregon campus, but for the last several years has actually been on the University of Oregon campus. I talk about this as the Global Health Biomarker Lab, and it's a lab that's focused in on the development as well as the application of minimally invasive techniques. So, for example, looking at fingerprint blood spots, looking at urine samples, looking at saliva samples, looking at different ways to get access to biological information, excuse me, in a minimally invasive way. So my lab has focused in on aspects of immune function, specifically on markers of inflammation like C-reactive protein and IL-6. We've also spent a lot of time focused in on predictors of chronic psychosocial stress. We've also looked at cardiovascular disease and developed new markers for measuring that and cardiovascular risk in minimally invasive samples. And we've also looked at reproductive function, notably looking at predictors of testosterone testosterone and the relationship between parasites and testosterone, as well as between testosterone and immune function. So a lot of work that we've done over the years looking at ways to tap into aspects of health and physiology and to be able to apply this in field settings, especially places like Russia or in Ecuador, but also increasingly locally in places like Eugene or Woodburn or other parts of Oregon or in the United States. In addition to the work that I do for research, which is published in academic journals, I'm also deeply involved in my community, especially community engagement related to health issues. So since 2011, I've been involved in what we call the Dia de Salud Health Fair. It was something that I started in conjunction with Huerto de la Familia back in 2011. And each year, although we weren't able to do it this year, but each year we've organized an annual health fair that serves individuals from the local community who don't have access to medical care. So we've served over 700 individuals since the start of this. And in large part, this is through this wonderful relationship we have with Huerto de la Familia, but also with the MAPS program, which is not the Corona Core or not the Corona MAPS program, but is the earlier one, which is the Minority Association of Pre-Medical Students. So each year we typically have about 16 pre-medical students who participate in this event and get training and give back to the community. And then in the last year, I've been involved in the development of Corona Core with several wonderful colleagues, Jeff Mizell, Angela Long, Dennis Galvan, Ellie Vandergrift, as well as dozens of students, in fact, well over 50 students now who have been part of this. So Corona Core has an academic mission, and that's this lecture series is connected to that. But then there's also the public health piece that Corona Core is leading, which is essentially providing contact tracing for COVID as well as Corona Core care for University of Oregon students, but also the community as a whole. And we've been working very closely with Lane County Public Health to serve all of Lane County in terms of COVID responses. So you see here in these pictures our wonderful contact tracing staff. Also a real shout out here to Jeff Mizell and Angie Long, who are the main people who are doing the supervision of students in this public health response, both the care team as well as the COVID tracing team. And in the middle of that lower picture, you can see Oregon Senator Ron Wyden, who visited several months ago to talk to the students involved with Corona Core. So we're really working to not only help our community and our state, but we're really hoping that Corona Core can be a model for some sort of a student core related to COVID as well as other infectious diseases in the future. And we believe we have a really good supporter here in terms of Senator Ron Wyden. So this is near the end now of this part one of this COVID crash course. And the following 5 videos are going to be focusing in on different aspects of COVID. So in the second video, I'll talk about the basics. Part 3, I'll focus in on the impact of COVID. Part 4 will focus in on the most vulnerable to COVID and talk about social determinants of health. Part 5 will focus in on a few of the key issues. One being immunity. So once you've had COVID, how long are you immune? So asking questions like that. But then also tackling the topic of vaccines and vaccination. And then in part 6, the final one of this series, I'll talk about the U.S. failure and then where I see us going as a country and a world from here. Finally, I just wanted to end by providing a link. So if you're interested in learning more about me and my work, here's the link to my website. So thank you for watching.